Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're focusing on the latest chapter in the UK-EU relationship, specifically the outcomes from the recent summit. We know many of you follow these intricate details closely, so we want to go beyond just the headlines. Our mission today is really to unpack the key agreements using the UK government's own explainer as our source. We'll dig into what they mean, their potential impacts, get a bit more detailed.
Yes, exactly. It's a complex relationship, always evolving. And these agreements, they do seem quite significant across several important areas. The government document gives us a lot to work with, so it's crucial that we look closely at the specifics. What are the potential long-term effects,
Right.
for both sides?
Right. Let's start with agri-food. It's a sector well, it's seen some major shifts since Brexit. The
Uh,
explainer itself says the EU is the UK's biggest market here, but it also points to a pretty sharp drop in trade between 2018 and 2024. Exports down 21%, imports 7%. What's behind that?
Well, those figures really reflect the new complexities that came in post-Brexit.
Hmm.
The source mentions a mix of things: extra costs, naturally, a lot more paperwork, and border delays. And you can understand why that would make businesses, especially in agri-food, rethink things. Some scaled back, some maybe even stopped trading with the EU altogether. So it's against that backdrop that this new sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, the SPS zone agreement, becomes really quite significant.
Okay, the SPS agreement. It sounds like a direct answer to those trade headaches. They mention removing export health certificates, potentially saving up to £200 per consignment. That sounds like it could add up fast, especially for mixed loads.
Oh, absolutely. Those export health certificates, or EHCs, they're official documents. They verify animal products meet EU health standards. Before this agreement, every single consignment needed one. Think about the cost, the admin time, the hassle. It all created friction.
Right.
So removing that requirement, that's a direct saving, both money and time for UK exporters. And it's similar for plant health certificates, those organic product inspection certificates, even the marketing standard stuff. Removing or simplifying those also eases the burden.
The source also talks about ending routine border checks on agri-food. It mentions 100% paperwork checks currently, and physical checks on up to 30% of things like British dairy, fish, eggs, red meat. That sounds like a big hurdle.
A very big hurdle. Removing those routine checks should have some clear, practical benefits. First, faster transit times,
Yeah.
especially for fresh stuff, getting to supermarkets quicker. Second, less paperwork means lower admin costs for businesses.
Yes.
Simple as that. And third, getting rid of those physical checks up to 30% on key exports reduces delays and, the costs linked to those delays.
Okay.
And it works the other way, too. Removing routine checks on some EU imports, like milk, dairy, plants, potatoes, that could streamline things coming in, maybe even lower costs here eventually.
And it also mentions some British products that were actually banned, like fresh sausages, some shellfish, seed potatoes that can now be traded again.
Precisely. That reopens markets for UK producers. That's potential growth, more revenue. It's quite tangible for those specific sectors. And there are other things, too, like easier pet travel, multi-use passports instead of single-use certificates, cheaper, simpler for people traveling with pets, plus the smoother GBNI movement by removing SBS rules there that tackles a really tricky part of the post-Brexit setup.
Okay, let's shift gears to energy cooperation. The goal here seems to be better energy security, helping the economy, and hitting those net zero targets. Putting the energy chapter of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, on a permanent footing, that sounds like it's about stability.
It is. Stability is absolutely key in the energy sector. Think about investments in big infrastructure projects, renewables, grid upgrades. These things take years, huge amounts of money. So having that long-term certainty in a cooperative framework, well, it encourages that investment. It reduces the risk.
Right. And the explainer mentions exploring UK involvement in EU electricity trading platforms. It says current trading is inefficient, adds costs. How would joining those platforms help?
Okay, so right now, trading electricity across the channel is, well, it's not as smooth as it could be. It's less efficient than being part of the integrated EU market platforms. This adds transaction costs, can make prices a bit higher, introduces friction. Joining those platforms would basically mean more streamlined buying and selling of electricity across borders. Think real-time auctions, better matching of supply and demand.
I see.
It's especially useful for managing renewables, like all that offshore wind in the North Sea. Getting access could lead to more efficient use of that power, potentially lower bills, and help develop those North Sea resources faster.
And it also mentions working together on clean energy tech, hydrogen, carbon capture.
Yes, that's another important piece. Cooperating on these sort of cutting-edge technologies is mutually beneficial. I mean, sharing knowledge, maybe joint research, coordinating efforts. It helps both the UK and EU move towards their net zero goals, plus it can create jobs and growth in those green industries.
Okay, now on to the emissions trading systems, the ETS. The plan is to link the UK and EU systems. Could you just briefly explain what an ETS is and why linking them is a big deal?
Sure. An ETS is basically a cap and trade system for carbon emissions. A limit, a cap, is set on total emissions from certain sectors, like heavy industry or power generation. Companies get or buy allowances for each ton of CO2 they emit, and that cap gets lower over time, pushing them to cut emissions. After Brexit, the UK set up its own ETS, separate from the EU's bigger one.
Right.
The issue is a smaller market like the UK's can mean more volatile carbon prices. That makes it harder for businesses to plan big investments in green tech. Plus, there was the risk of the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, the CBAM, hitting UK exports about 7 BNS worth, the source says.
Okay, so CBAM is like a carbon tariff on imports.
Essentially, yes. It aims to prevent carbon leakage, where EU companies might move production to places with weaker climate policies. It puts a charge on imports based on their carbon content if they come from places without a comparable carbon price.
So linking the UK and EU ETS is meant to avoid that CBAM charge and stabilize prices.
Exactly. Linking creates a larger, more liquid carbon market. That should mean more stable, predictable carbon prices. That stability helps industry invest in decarbonization with more confidence. It makes it a cheaper path to net zero, as the explainer puts it. And crucially, it should exempt UK exports from those EU CBAM costs.
It also simplifies things, potentially making the UK more attractive for, say, carbon capture projects storing CO2 from EU emitters.
So a potentially significant move for industry and climate goals.
Potentially, yes. Though the effectiveness still depends on the actual carbon price level across the linked market being strong enough to drive real change. Got it. The explainer also mentions Steel the EU restoring the UK's country-specific quota to historical levels after 2026. Why does that matter?
It matters because it protects tariff-free access for a larger volume of British steel exports to the EU. Steel quotas limit how much can be sold tariff-free. Restoring it to historic levels means more UK steel can enter the EU without facing tariffs, which obviously helps the competitiveness and financial health of the UK steel sector.
Okay. Moving on to security, law enforcement, and judicial cooperation. The text acknowledges good cooperation exists under the TCA, but the criminal landscape has changed. What's planned here?
Yeah, the idea is to enhance what's already there because, crime evolves. So several areas highlighted: better information sharing with the EU Drugs Agency on drug threats, more operational work with Europol, especially on serious organized crime. Then there's boosting biometric data exchange, including facial images, which is quite significant for identification. Also, sharing more criminal records, especially for non-EU nationals, and making it easier to get electronic data from service providers across borders, vital for online crime investigations.
And judicial cooperation.
Yes, exploring ways to improve things like extradition and mutual legal assistance, the formal processes for getting help in investigations and prosecutions across borders. And there's also a nod to positive civil judicial cooperation, which is important for things like cross-border business disputes or family law.
Right, that makes sense. Now, irregular migration, the explainer says the TCA left a gap here, and this agreement is a significant step forward. What does this cooperation involve?
It seems to be about creating a much broader framework for working together on migration. It uses the phrase whole-of-route approach. So that means cooperating on practical ways to deter irregular migration, things like returns, trying to prevent channel crossings, border security work. It also means working together in source and transit countries, sharing expertise, coordinating internationally, focusing on key regions. Tackling visa abuse and other ways the legal system might be misused is another part. And finally, building stronger links with EU agencies like Europol, the Asylum Agency, Frontex, the Border Agency, and the European Migration Network. Sharing analysis, expertise, operational cooperation, best practices, that kind of thing.
Okay, quite comprehensive. What about the wider defense and security picture? There's mention of a new UK-EU security and defense partnership.
Yes, this is framed as being complementary to NATO, based on shared geography, history, values. The objectives listed are about ensuring UK interests are represented at a high level, so more regular talks with EU leaders. Boosting cooperation on specific issues supporting Ukraine is mentioned, tackling hybrid threats.
What are hybrid threats exactly?
Good question. They're basically hostile actions that fall short of conventional warfare, things like cyber attacks, spreading disinformation, economic pressure, interfering in elections. Nasty stuff, but below the threshold of open conflict.
Got it. So cooperation on those, military mobility, space security, protecting critical infrastructure.
Exactly. And also closer work in international organizations, crisis response.
Hmm.
It also sets a framework for potentially working more closely on defense industry stuff, maybe joint investment, exploring links with the EU's defense funding instruments like SAFE.
And development and health security.
Yes, a regular dialogue on development issues, better cooperation on disaster response and humanitarian aid.
Hmm.
And exploring more cooperation on health security, like pandemic preparedness, seems sensible given recent history.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, shifting focus again, youth and education. An agreement to work towards a youth experience scheme and exploring rejoining Erasmus plus stay.
Yes, on the youth scheme, the idea is cultural exchange. The explainer stresses that the details need negotiating, but the UK's position is it would have parameters like no access to benefits, no right for dependents to come along, and agreed numbers, similar to existing UK schemes.
And Erasmus plus.
The possibility of associating with Erasmus Plus is back on the table,
Mm.
but the UK says only on significantly improved financial terms.
Mm.
If it happened, it would open up lots of opportunities again, school exchanges, work placements, study abroad, youth projects, even grassroots sport training. But the cost is clearly a key sticking point for the UK.
Understood. Now, fisheries. The current adjustment period ends in mid-2026. What's this new 12-year deal about?
It's about providing longer-term stability after 2026. The core is continued reciprocal access. UK boats fish in EU waters, EU boats in UK waters. That access is apparently worth about 80 pound-meters a year to the UK fleet. So 12 years of that gives fishers more certainty to plan and invest.
But the UK keeps control of its waters.
Yes, the explainer is clear on that. The UK remains outside the EU's common fisheries policy, retains sovereignty over its waters, and it keeps the quota uplift agreed in the TCA, that 25% transfer of EU quota shares to the UK, worth about 175 meters in 2025 values.
And there are other benefits mentioned for fishing.
Yes, linked back to the SBS changes we discussed earlier. Removing those export health certificates for fish could save thousands on a mixed lorry load. No more 100% paperwork checks, or those up to 30% physical checks on British fish exports. And reopening trade for shellfish from certain GB waters previously banned by the EU.
Okay. And briefly, what about touring artists, business mobility, and e-gates?
Right, these are covered more briefly. For touring artists, it says both sides recognize the importance of culture and exchange, and they'll keep working on supporting travel for artists. The UK will explore improving touring arrangements with the EU and member states. No concrete deal yet, but an intention.
And business travel.
For business mobility and recognizing professional qualifications, they've agreed to set up specific dialogues. Basically, a forum to talk about the barriers UK service providers face when working short-term in the EU, and maybe find ways to smooth things out.
Okay. And e-gates. Many travelers will be interested in this.
Yes. Since Brexit, UK nationals haven't generally been able to use the automated e-gates in the Schengen zone. The news here is the EU Commission confirmed there's no legal reason why UK nationals can't use them once the EU's new entry-exit system, EES, is running. So where the infrastructure allows, UK passport holders should be able to use e-gates across Europe again. The UK will work with member states to make this happen more widely. That should speed things up at the border.
So looking back at everything we've covered, it really is a wide range of agreements coming out of the summit. A lot of ground covered.
It really is. Across trade, energy, security, migration, mobility. It does feel like a move towards a more, perhaps defined and arguably more cooperative relationship in many areas. Less ambiguity, perhaps.
And summing up the key benefits for the UK, as presented in this government source.
Well, the main themes are reduced trade friction, particularly in agri-food and fisheries, new economic opportunities, maybe through energy cooperation or reopened markets, stronger security partnerships, and improvements for citizens, like potentially easier travel with pets or smoother border crossings via e-gates eventually, and maybe those youth and education opportunities, depending on negotiations.
This has been incredibly helpful, really getting into the weeds of these agreements. Thank you for bringing so much clarity.
My pleasure. It's important work, looking beyond the headlines to understand what these things actually mean on the ground.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, perhaps the takeaway thought is this. How might these agreements, taken together, actually shape the UK-EU relationship going forward? What's the direction of travel? And what other areas might need addressing down the line? Something to consider as we wrap up this deep dive.